thought they were helping science, until the screaming started. In 1961, a psychologist asked a terrifying question: how far would ordinary people go if an authority figure told them to continue? The answer shocked the world. The terrifying part was that most participants showed visible fear, but obeyed anyway. New Haven, Connecticut. A man answers a newspaper advertisement. The ad offers $4, modest pay for 1 hour of participation in a study on learning and memory at Yale University. He arrives, meets a researcher in a gray lab coat, and is introduced to another participant. They draw lots to determine roles. He draws teacher. The other man draws learner. The learner is taken to an adjacent room and strapped into a chair. Electrodes are attached to his wrist. The teacher sits before an imposing electrical shock generator, a large machine with 30 switches, each labeled with a voltage ranging from 15 volts, marked slight shock, up to 450 volts, marked simply XXX. The researcher explains, the teacher will read word pairs to the learner through an intercom. When the learner answers incorrectly, the teacher will administer an electric shock, increasing by 15 volts with each wrong answer. The experiment begins. The learner makes errors. The teacher administers shocks. At 75 volts, a grunt comes through the intercom. At 120 volts, the learner shouts that the shocks are painful. At 150 volts, he demands to be released. At 270 volts, an agonized scream. At 300 volts, he refuses to answer at all. At 330 volts, silence. The teacher turns to the researcher, distressed, uncertain. The researcher responds with one of 4 scripted prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. In Stanley Milgram's original 1961 experiment, 65% of participants administered the maximum 450-volt shock. Every single participant continued to at least 300 volts. The learner, of course, was an actor. The shocks were not real, but the obedience was. What Milgram had demonstrated, and what he spent the rest of his career trying to make people understand, was not that humans are cruel. It was something far more unsettling, that ordinary, decent people will cause serious harm to a stranger not out of malice, not out of ideology, but simply because someone in authority told them to continue. The Milgram experiment has been replicated dozens of times across different countries, cultures, and decades. A 2009 replication by psychologist Jerry Berger at Santa Clara University, using an updated ethical protocol that stopped at 150 volts, found obedience rates of 70%, virtually identical to Milgram's original findings nearly 50 years later. Cross-cultural replications in Germany, Australia, Jordan, and Spain have found comparable results. The phenomenon is not American, not era-specific, not explained by the particular stresses of the early 1960s. It is human. To understand why, you need to understand what Milgram himself identified as the core mechanism, what he called the agentic state. Under normal conditions, Milgram argued, people operate in an autonomous state, making decisions according to their own values, experiencing themselves as moral agents responsible for their actions. But in hierarchical situations, particularly those involving legitimate authority, people shift into an agentic state in which they experience themselves not as independent agents, but as instruments of someone else's will. In the agentic state, moral responsibility does not disappear. It is transferred upward to the authority giving the orders. This transfer of responsibility is not a rationalization constructed after the fact. It is a genuine shift in psychological experience, measurable in how participants talked about what they were doing. Milgram's participants consistently used language of agency removal. I had no choice. He told me to. I was just doing what the experiment required. They were not lying about their experience. Their experience had genuinely changed. Neuroscience has since provided a biological basis for this phenomenon. A 2016 study by neuroscientist Patrick Haggard at University College London used a variation of the Milgram paradigm while measuring participants' sense of agency, their felt ownership of their own actions. When participants acted under coercion from an authority figure, their sense of agency measurably decreased, as reflected in distorted time perception of the relationship between their action and its consequence. Being ordered to do something literally changes the brain's experience of doing it. You feel less like the author of your own action, and feeling less like the author, you feel less responsible for the outcome. The standard reading of Milgram is about obedience to authority, but the deeper findings, the ones that emerged from Milgram's 18 variations of the experiment, reveal something more nuanced and more practically important than a simple lesson about following orders. Proximity changed everything. When the learner was in the same room as the teacher, visible, present, physically real, obedience dropped significantly. When the teacher had to physically hold the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience dropped further still. Distance, Milgram found, is not merely physical, it is moral. The further you are from the consequences of your actions, spatially, psychologically, institutionally, the easier those actions become. This is why harm delivered through bureaucratic systems, financial instruments, or digital interfaces generates so little resistance. The suffering exists somewhere else, attached to someone you cannot see, separated from your action by layers of abstraction. Legitimacy was more powerful than instructions. When the experiment was conducted not at Yale University but in a run-down commercial building in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with no institutional affiliation, obedience dropped by nearly 20%. The content of the researchers' instructions was identical. What changed was the perceived legitimacy of the context. Authority is not located in the individual giving orders. It is located in the institutional framework that makes those orders seem appropriate. Strip the framework, and the orders lose much of their power. Peer resistance was the most powerful intervention of all. In one variation, 2 additional Confederates posed as fellow teachers, and at 150 volts they refused to continue and walked away. In this condition, obedience dropped to just 10%. Not 65%. 10. The single most effective force against destructive obedience was not individual moral courage. It was watching someone else exercise moral courage first. The social proof that resistance was possible, legitimate, and survivable was enough to liberate the majority of participants from the agentic state. This finding may be the most important of everything Milgram discovered. We tend to imagine moral courage as a solitary act, the individual who stands alone against the group. In reality, moral courage is profoundly social. It requires a model. It requires seeing that someone else did it and did not collapse. The person who speaks first in a meeting, who names what others are only thinking, who refuses visibly, they are not just expressing their own values. They are giving permission to everyone around them. The Milgram experiment is not history. It is not a story about other people in a different era. The psychological mechanisms it revealed, the agentic state, the transfer of responsibility, the power of legitimacy and proximity and peer behavior are operating in your life, in ordinary situations, right now. They operate in workplaces where people implement policies they privately find harmful because their manager instructed them to. In medical systems where junior staff defer to senior authority against their own clinical judgment. A dynamic studied extensively after research into preventable hospital errors found that hierarchical deference was among the leading contributing factors. In families where harmful dynamics persist across generations because the authority of the family system makes questioning them feel illegitimate. In online environments where the scale and abstraction of digital harm makes ordinary people comfortable with behavior they would never engage in face-to-face. Understanding this is not about assigning blame, it is about developing what psychologists call situational awareness, the capacity to recognize when you are in a context that is pulling your behavior in a direction that conflicts with your values before you have already acted. The research offers several specific tools for developing this awareness. The first is perspective-taking toward the recipient of your actions. Milgram's proximity findings demonstrate that making the harmed person real, their face, their experience, their humanity, is one of the most reliable ways to interrupt the agentic state. When you find yourself in a situation where you are following instructions that affect someone else, the practice of genuinely imagining that person's experience is not sentimentality. It is a neurological intervention against moral disengagement. The second tool is pre-commitment to stated values. Research on moral behavior consistently finds that people who have articulated their values explicitly, to themselves or others, are significantly more likely to act in accordance with them under pressure. The values that exist only as vague feelings are far more vulnerable to situational override than values that have been named, examined, and committed to. Writing them down matters. Saying them aloud matters more. The third tool is the one Milgram's own research identified as most powerful: finding and being the first voice. In any situation where you sense that something is wrong, where the pressure of authority or group consensus is pulling toward harm, the most important thing is not waiting for certainty before speaking. It is speaking early enough that others still can. The participant who refused at 150 volts liberated the room. The one who waited until 420 volts had already become complicit in everything that came before. 65% of ordinary people harmed a stranger because they were told to, but 35% did not. And in every variation where one person refused visibly and early, that 35% grew to 90%. The difference between a world that produces atrocity and one that doesn't is rarely the absence of pressure toward harm. It is the presence of someone who speaks first. You can be that person. The research shows you are far more likely to be if you decide in advance that you will. The experiment revealed something disturbing. Evil does not always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks completely normal.